Sabbath, much more than worship. I think one of the issues with, or one of the many issues with Sabbath is what it has become. Sabbath has not been a consistent understanding of what Sabbath is for a very long time, and what it has become is very different than what it started out as. So first, I think Sabbath has become something very personal. It's about my well-being and my needs. Sabbath has been associated with the idea of rest and personal rest. What do I need to refresh myself? What do I need to take care of myself? What does, even the sabbatical is understanding of for one person to get better taken care of or develop in some way. This term has become very personal and is about oneself's well-being and needs. And I think it's become very rare experience. It has not been something that is something that we're really good at anymore. The idea of truly finding understanding of Sabbath. The idea of Sunday being dedicated to Sabbath keeping, or Saturday for our Jewish friends, or Wednesday night church nights. There is no, in our culture, we have no longer keep a time set aside for Sabbath, and so it is becoming more rare over time and often hard to find an idea of Sabbath, and it is not exactly supported by social pressures or norms. There used to be a time in which businesses, clubs, and everything would go out of their way to make sure that there was time for Sabbath keeping, and that's just not the case anymore. Sabbath just doesn't have the support of the societal pressures and is no longer a norm. And I would say Sabbath has been lost to the Lord of productivity and efficiency. We as a culture have begun to value the idea that we must be producing something. We have to be productive, and the idea that when we're productive, we have to be efficient. That we go out of our way to find productivity and efficiency, which has nothing to do with Sabbath. The Sabbath, it flies in the face of the understanding of being productive and efficient. It is neither of those things, and it's kind of this idea that what is more important, what we do or who we are, and so we as a culture has created an understanding that we are valued by what we do and how good we are at doing it, and the idea of producing something and being efficient at it, which is kind of countercultural to the idea of Sabbath. So right now, at its best, Sabbath has become about worship. And so we look at Sabbath and we desire our worship to act as Sabbath. So we desire Sabbath out of worship. So we want worship to give us comfort, to be restful, and to be renewing, which isn't really what worship is about either, right? But that's for another adult forum. So we have created this understanding that we've equated Sabbath with worship, and we expect worship to give us what Sabbath has created. But worship and Sabbath aren't the same thing, and they weren't. And for most of the origins of the story of Sabbath, worship and Sabbath were not the same thing at all, not even meant to be on the same day, or the same experience. Worship was something that was constant. Sabbath was a break, and that this worship was something you did every day, and everything you did, it was an act of worship. Sabbath was a moment. So the idea that worship and Sabbath are the same things, that we've created that understanding, is a misnomer. And if we always expect worship to be comfortable and renewing and restful, instead of challenging us or calling us to task or setting us up or vocationizing us, then if you come into worship expecting a restful, comfortable experience and all to be familiar, and you get something that's going to energize you, convict you, and set you apart, you're going to have some tension there. And so what Sabbath started as a part of God's character. We first have to understand that Sabbath was God's desire. God went through the creation process in Genesis, and on the seventh day, because God had been working, God desired rest. God wanted rest. God created rest. And it was for God's own sake. It was God's own desire and for God's own self to do this. And so it was part of God's character to rest. All right. And so at first, it wasn't even for me or for you. It was a way of discerning who God was. God went through the 6 days, created everything, and God then decided, I'm going to rest. And so it was God's character. It was God's idea for God's own self that this was important. Now, I will talk later about why that might be. But I think what's really important as we get into this is Sabbath was God's understanding of God's own self. And so then the next step happened where then Sabbath became a gift to God's people. And so as the people was creating its own idea of who they are and created a community in the wilderness, Sabbath then was a gift from God to God's people. And we talked about that. And we're going to talk about that today. And then Sabbath then became something that made the Israelites different and then despised. And so the Israelites got Sabbath from their God, and because no other culture had Sabbath, and this was one of the things that set them apart from Greeks, Romans, and all these other pagan gods that treated their people as worker bees and never had a chance to rest or never had a chance to be separated or be not working, and used humanity as pretty much their toy. When Jewish people started to say, wait a minute, this is an understanding of our God and the gift that God is giving us, then with Israelites having Sabbath, became despised by the dominant culture, and one of the reasons that Jewish people were oppressed in the process was their understanding of Sabbath. So then what was next? God's character, a gift to God's people. So in the process of being different in the face of the dominant culture, it became a communal ethic and was meant to hold the people together against the outside forces of the dominant culture. So they defended Sabbath so much so that it became a capital. So something that was so important, I said, defending Sabbath was so important that the violation became a capital offense. If you broke Sabbath, if you didn't participate in Sabbath, you were supposed to be stoned to death or killed. So because it was so important to be an alternative culture, they brought it back into the situation in which if you even broke this, it was a capital offense. You could be killed for breaking Sabbath. So then Sabbath became truly a unique understanding of the qualities that a person and a community should have. It was something made to separate themselves apart and to understand God and what God people should be like. How do we understand that? How do we know this? All right. So in Genesis 2, 1 through 4, so really the first creation story ends in the beginning of chapter 2. I hope you understand, like the Genesis 1 ends with at the end of 6 days. No rest. There's no rest in chapter 1. Rest starts in chapter 2. But chapter 2 contains most of the second retelling of the creation stories. But chapter 2 also has the beginning of Sabbath in it. So it's a little strange how they even chose to parse these things up. You would expect the seventh day to be a part of chapter 1 because it's the conclusion of all the rest of the days. But they literally started off chapter 2 with what we call the first day of the week, Sabbath. And so they talk about Sabbath in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. So let's read it quick here. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he done in creation. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. So that's the end of the first creation story, but the beginning of chapter 2. And so in there, you can understand that this is God's prerogative. This is God's decision. This is God's hope for God's own self in the process. This is meant to be for us, for God's kind of position. I'm going to see, I think there's a few people that are, nope. All right. I was thinking that people were wanting to get on. I wanted to check that. Hold on.
He's just checking to see that we're paying attention.
That's right.
Yeah.
Anybody else out there?
And so one of the things that was interesting to me is the first 6 days is when he worked, and the seventh day finished the work, right? That the work isn't done until he rested. Do you understand that? Like, resting is an essential part of the creation's experience. He created the first 6 days and all the beauty of the creation of the first days, and he called each one of it good, and it was wonderful. And then resting is the finishing part of it. Resting is finishing. Like that's powerful. The understanding that resting is finishing the work, that it wasn't finished. Anything wasn't finished until he rested, right? Until God rested. All right. So the work was done, and he blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, made it holy, made it separated itself. And so if we understand, a lot of scholars believe that chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Genesis were added at a later time to the creation, so that when the people were either stuck in the wilderness or stuck in situations, that they created these creation stories to resemble the predicament they're in. And so to help them understand the predicament they're in, they have these creation stories as a foundation understanding of the predicament they're in. And so there is a value choice in understanding that God blessed the seventh day and set it aside, made it holy, set it aside. Because on it, God rested from all the work that is done in creation. There seems to be an understanding here that if we kind of personified God is on the seventh day is marveling at the creation God made. God in the seventh day is looking at what has done and honored it and hallowed it and like marveled at it, and there's a sense of appreciation for creation by finishing it and resting on it. If you've created a project, if you've done art, and when you feel that it's done and you look at it and go, look at that, right? That's the kind of emotion that I feel that God is doing on the seventh day. And God is literally resting and marveling at the creation that has happened. For these are the generations of heaven and earth when they were created. Just soaking it in. God chose to soak it in on the seventh day. And while soaking it in, separates it for an alternative reality. So at the beginning here, we see that it's a part of God's decision, God's character, God's hope for the world, God's hope for creation to have Sabbath, and hallows it and set it aside. So how does this become a part of society? So when the Israelites were a part of the exile, after being forced labor in the Egyptian rule, and they leave and they're in the wilderness, they are provided by God 2 basic necessities, right? Quail and manna, right? They're in the wilderness and they have quail and manna. The Sabbath comes back into conversation at that point, not really before, but at that point, trying to probably break down the idea that they're no longer slaves anymore, that they don't have to constantly work. And so they're in the wilderness trying to create a society. And I forgot what I was going to say. I forgot chapter 2 of this. So I'm going to back up. That's like on the next slide. All right. Hold bank that for me. So God hoped this for creation, and then the creation broke it, right? Then the creation broke it. So in Genesis 3, God then says, because of the distrust of Adam and Eve, the curse is on Adam particularly, is that the toil, the working kills. So cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all of the days of your life. Thorns and sisters shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. But the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, and you are dust, and dust shall you. Like, the part of the falling of society is that work kills. Before the fall of society, work was to be a life-giving understanding of love. If you were vocation, you had a gift, you were set aside, you were marveled over by God. When the fall happens in the story, work becomes something that happens all the days of your life, right? Part of sin is the understanding that you lose Sabbath. You lose the ability of understanding Sabbath. Sin takes away Sabbath. The fall takes away Sabbath. You work all the days of your life. Thorn and sister shall bring you forth. You shall eat the plants of the field by the sweat of your face. This is going to be hard work, and you will always do it. And when the eaten bread will turn to ground, and you will die, that you will be worked to death because of sin. Right? All right. Now I'll go to what I was about to talk about. So, in the wilderness, in the desert, God provides manna on the ground, but not every day, right? So on the 6th day, they gathered twice as much food, 2 omers apiece. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Today is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil, and all that is left over put aside and be kept until morning." So they put aside until morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not become foul, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it. On the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, there will be none." All right, so that is Moses telling him of the process or understanding of how Sabbath is a gift to the Israelites in the wilderness. But then on the 7th day, some of the people went out to gather.
Sure.
And they found none. What? Are you surprised? What's going on? They found none. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments?" And that is my Sabbath and instructions. "See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the 6th day, he gives you food for 2 days. Each of you stay where you are. Do not leave your place on the 7th day." So the people rested on the 7th day. And so here's an understanding of what the fall looks like. God gives the gift of the Sabbath to the people. God provides for the Sabbath. That is, the food will not rotten. Before, you're not supposed to keep it. It was a full trust movement that you get what you need for the day, and the next day the next rations are going to show up, and the next day the rations will show up. And if you tried to hoard it on the rest of the other days, it got bad by worms and became foul. But on the last day, 6th day, you could collect more than 1 day's, and it would not go foul. And that was the promises of God through Moses. But in both situations, either you collect too much or you didn't trust on Thursday. the understanding is they went out already on the Sabbath day. They went to work. They decided to go to work. Why would they go to work? Well, they didn't trust. They didn't have an act of trust. They didn't trust the promise. They didn't trust what Moses was saying. They went to work. They lived into that workless mentality found in the fallen society in chapter 3. And so there we have like the beginnings of it. It's meant to be a gift. It was meant to be a sabbatical understanding, and this is what sets us apart from being slaves. We are no longer slaves anymore. We are a people who rest, and we rest because we trust God. And the act of testing God, of working on the Sabbath, is an exercise of distrust. All right. So, in conclusion, the first Sabbath was something God valued for God's own self. God wanted to finish things and rest. Resting for God showed confidence in creation, right? God trusted creation by resting. God thought that creation was created good and underneath its purpose. And so God resting was, in a sense, God admiring the work God had done and trusting him to do what God set it up to do. Tireless, relentless work is a consequence of a falling world. A world without Sabbath is a world with sin. And so a world without Sabbath is one bondage to work. A life without Sabbath means death. So, trying to create a civilized society, Moses integrated God's character with the character of the community. Sabbath became the evidence, or the proof that they didn't have trust in God. So Sabbath became a mark of what it meant to be a Jew and an outwardly sign of the faithfulness of the people. So Sabbath is ultimately an exercise of trust. And I think we're going to get into this. We're going to get in next week into a bit more of the Sabbath as a rule of a union, a specific union of the people. But here we can understand, it was so important as an exercise of the people that they did everything possible to institutionalize a Sabbath within the people. And if you ever get a chance and be around Jews that are probably more Hasidic, you will understand how much they choose this life of Sabbath, and how much they go against any kind of other understanding of what Sabbath should be. And there's an interesting passage that I'm going to get down the road that talks about Jewish people would even hire people that didn't keep Sabbath rules to be able to work for them on the Sabbath. So that they could keep some form of piety of their, and so that's kind of an interesting use of Sabbath, right? But so ultimately this idea of Sabbath is, what kind of trust do we have? All right. Any questions about this morning?
I have a comment, Pastor Dietrich.
Sure.
First of all, thanks for being there in the sanctuary. I can see the sanctuary behind you there, and I think I can see that. And
it's a fake. It's a fake picture.
Is it?
I'm not actually there.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I'm actually there right now. So thank you for at least putting that up for us. Secondly, when I was working, I worked for Jewish surgeons in an ambulatory surgery center, and one of the doctors had surgery on Sundays. He would bring in patients on Sundays. It wasn't his Sabbath, and so he brought them in, and we worked. So anyway, it's interesting to have that experience in here in Metro Detroit. So anyway, that was a interesting experience, and there were nurses who absolutely refused to work on Sunday. I did not refuse. I figured God knows where I am, and if I'm at work, I'm okay.
Even though my picture hasn't been here, I've been hearing you as I've been doing things in other rooms and so forth. So I can multitask, and this is it.
That's efficiency.
Wait a minute. That, isn't that changing the definition again?
Yes, I guess it is.
No.
And then there are Jews that take it so seriously that, you know, they won't even open a refrigerator because that would cause use of electricity and somebody has to work to give you the electricity.
Wow. I don't know.
What do you guys think? What do you guys think about Sabbath being a part of God's own character?
I think it's perfectly understandable. It's because God is perfect and perfect in his creative abilities. He doesn't leave anything undone. It is a part of his ability to completely create and completely finish a completely perfect work. He never leaves things. He never leaves any loose ends. And I think it's perfectly understandable, given the attributes of God, that he would rest. It's also, I think, a good lesson for our human bodies that need for rest.
Love it. I just wrote down a little sticky note for myself that said to remind myself that God is a creative God, because you know, we often think about him as someone that's taking care of everything and is in charge, but the fact that he loves to be creative is cool. It makes me smile. There's a process that I'm doing a lot right now when I make a movie for school. Once the movie is done, I have a computer program that puts all these things together. You have to press a button where it's rendering it. It's putting it all together, and you have to wait while the computer thinks and puts it all together. And then at the end, it says finish. And then it is done. But I mean, I've done all my work and I just have to let the computer do the rest of it, right? And then it's finished. It reminded me of that. And it's so cool that God is like, he loves, and then I know exactly what you're talking about, Pastor, when you're like, hey, look at this. I made this. Come and see it. You know, you're like, well, I did that. And I think it's so cool that part of us that, you know, we have that feeling too. That's God's gift to us, of the feeling of the joy of the creative process. And I think in our world right now, where everything is, how much money is it a job that's good? I mean, even for me, like my job, why are you teaching music? What does it do? Does it make you, will kids study music? How are they going to use that to make money or to be profitable? But just the idea that we can enjoy the humanness of us, or in this case, the gift of God of being creative. I love it. It's just great.
I think
Go ahead.
I think one of the interesting things for me is I'm not exactly sure. I think the understanding that God rests, it kind of goes two ways for me. It is kind of it's a good thing, but then it's also scary that God actually rests. You know, that, you know, sometimes if you know, we may want something done. We want this virus to go away, or we want this to happen, or we have this list of what we think should be done and what needs to be gone, or we have this hope, but we also have this evidence or this desire that God rests, and that's kind of an interesting, like, unsettling thing a little bit for me. And so that idea of God resting, it kind of goes both ways. The understanding that it's a great gift, it's a great honoring gift, it's an important thing for us to understand. But then just the idea that God rests, that God steps and, you know, and looks at things, and God's, you know, God has a timing. God sits and bees. God just chooses to just be at times, which is a little unsettling for me.
Well, and if Sabbath is is about trust, then does that mean that, I mean, God was trusting that his creation, that God's creation was done well enough that it would work while he was resting, right? Or that it would sustain while God was resting. That reminder that God has placed a responsibility on us in a sense that God trusts us as a part of God's creation when God's resting. Yes? I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that's why the fall, especially for Adam, is tireless work.
Yeah.
In a poetic setting, that you'll be worked to death. That part of the fall of society is the lack of Sabbath and the lack of resting and constant worry about what's next, and the constant fall of insecurity. Insecurity is the outcome of the fall of Adam, and it's done poetically here, where it's talked about the sweat on your face, that you should eat the bread until the return to the ground. Like, but out of this you would take, and you are dust, and that's Ash Wednesday, right? We've heard that. From dust you come, from dust you shall return. This is
Yeah.
the lack of Sabbath is deadly.
I think the other thing we can weave into this is I watched the process of reflection come through education at every level. And it was recognized in a way it hadn't been recognized before. In other words, I've learned this, what does it mean? Or what has it happened? Like, Audrey, you get together and you said we'll talk about highs and lows. You know, it's that time to step back and think about what things mean. And that's become an important part of learning when people have time. And I think that can be wrapped up in Sabbath too, to take that time for that reflection.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of appreciation, the taking time to appreciate creation or whatever, you know, your creation or the creation of the earth, is the time to just appreciate it. And if you're working all the time or moving forward or doing something all the time, you are never taking time to appreciate what's around you with your family or with your yard or with nature or whatever. There's some real value in just taking time to appreciate things, and that is the one that worked best for me in terms of a definition of Sabbath or what it should mean.
Yeah, I think as a church, sometimes we forget to do that too. Like, we are committed to God's work, but do we rest and as a church communally step back and say, wow, look at what God has done here? Or are we on to the next event or next ministry or next, how are we celebrating? I mean, obviously the 150th is coming up next year, and that's going to be a great way for us to step back and celebrate and reflect on what God has done. But I think as a routine, I'm not sure that the church, that we are as a whole, good at just stepping back and saying, like, I think we're afraid of it too. Our culture kind of tells us we need to be humble, which we should, but then in response, we almost don't take the time to celebrate and admire and give a little round of applause for the way that God has worked in certain situations. So
a lot of times that is thought of as, well, that's a waste of time. We're not doing anything right now. That's
right.
Efficiency. And I think there's a difference between appreciate and assess. And you can step back and assess what you're doing, but that's a step in doing. and there's a time for just true appreciation without the next step of, well, okay, what am I going to do about that? I appreciate it, but I could improve it here. And there's a difference between assessment and appreciation, maybe.
Yeah, but then I still go back to reflect, and that's what does it mean? This and this and this happened, and yes, this was good, and that was good, and this was nice, and all this, but what does it mean? And that's a whole nother, that's a very internal level.
I look at this Exodus 16 passage in a little bit of the recent history of church in the modern area from 1900 on, where as the idea that we are meant, one of the main purposes of humanity was to produce things, and people were so, and then there became so many other things that were bigger productions, bigger entertainment values, and as everything like youth subculture took off, or even as simple as like as you know, Lions clubs and all these separate clubs, and as everybody was vying for the doing of society, and everything is kept on producing this idea that you are to produce, you're to produce. The church was right behind it. We have to provide more. We have to provide more youth culture. We have to provide something for the church to. We have to provide something for the kids to do all the time, and we decided to fight the same battle. And so we created. We continue to be a part of the problem as a church, and trying to fight and create more stuff to do, and we have to create more opportunity, more. And we were a part of the problem. I mean, I think we were kind of like the people on the seventh day, you know. Yeah, we heard the promise. Yeah, fine, God, you promised, but we're still going to go out looking every day. That's fine. Go ahead, God, say those things, but you know, that's all good, and you know, it's like the people say, yeah, that's all good and stuff, God, but we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. You know, we're not going to really listen. We're not going to really actually care, because we're going to try to compete with all this and try to be the best modern church and provide all the best programming and everything compared to everybody else, and fall right into that, the same thing that the society is telling everybody. And I think and we didn't win that battle. We're not winning that battle because it's not our battle. It's the wrong one.
The concept of rest, I just find it so interesting. The working in the garden or working around the house, those meditation, that all prayer, that all leads to rest. But if I sit down to do a puzzle, or jigsaw puzzle, or paint by numbers, I have an overriding sense of guilt that I have to fight, because I'm not, you know, what am I getting out of this?
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Not me.
I'm with you, Harry.
I have new perspective on Sabbath after visiting our Augustine Lutheran monastery brothers,
Mm-hmm.
and a different understanding of worship as well, as something that's constant and integrated into daily walk and daily life. And you know, and they worked hard, but they also prayed hard. You know, it was such an interesting pattern of life, that it was so countercultural. But it works a bit better with the understanding of what the biblical understanding of Sabbath is. Prayer is worship is an exercise of work. Sabbath is not exactly worship. Rest is not exactly worship, and they see worship in a whole different light. And I just really appreciated that.
Some of this is also tied up in American culture and urban culture. I grew up on a farm, and my mom talked about Sundays in her generation growing up, when everybody stayed on their farms and worked all week. And on Sunday, you went to church, and that was visiting day. So, you know, one member of your family or your neighborhood would cook, and everybody would come together, and that would be the time you spent with other people that week. And that was the time to reach out and really see people, because you didn't otherwise. And we're bombarded, like you said, with all these opportunities and all these people around us all the time. And America has different values and productivity than much of the world. So I think a lot of this is of our place and time.
Yeah. What's interesting about the Sabbath law as it began with Moses was Sabbath was trying to create a civilized society. Sabbath isn't really meant as a personal exercise, but for an ordered way of life together. Moses really wanted a culture, to create what I call here a civilized society. Rest is civilized. Constant work is uncivilized, right? This is the function of the Sabbath, is to create a civilized experience. This is, and when I use the word civilized, it's called order, right? Order. And so constant work is chaos, is constant, and is a mark, and is you know, detriment to society, which I think we right now experience the opposite. The more you work, the more civilized you are. Right? The harder you work, the more ordered you are. And I think one of the things that's kind of opposite in the understanding of Sabbath here is that having Sabbath is part of the civilized life. I think lastly here is the Sabbath is the ultimate exercise of trust. And this is when I'll get on my soapbox for a moment here. I think one of the hardest thing right now when I see rants about the staying at home process is most rants against the staying home process don't trust the government or don't trust the exercise or the people bringing it to them.
Yep.
And so whenever I see that, I think of this sabbatical understanding of things in which, and you look at the biomedical understanding that staying away from each other is a Sabbath experience, is literally providing the space for the virus to die, right? Us taking Sabbath, us being at our homes, not going out when we have choice. Our Sabbath keeping is bringing life to the world. Think about it. Us sitting here in our rooms, isolated, is a sabbatical for the world. I mean, they've tracked human pollution around their civic centers, and how the less driving we are now, the more the creation is giving break. Our lack of exercising on our freedom of driving everywhere is providing the license for the world to be what it is, and providing Sabbath for creation. And so, and Sabbath keeping is literally fighting this virus. This is literally the fight of it. And most people who are resistant to it also struggle with the trust of the process, trusting the people who are saying what they're saying, trusting what's going on. And so I think there is a hand in hand going on here with our current time away and our time in our houses, that our Sabbath keeping here is literally life-giving. And those who fight against it are having trouble having trust in what's going on. Rant ended.